mean, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and talk about, COP26, because this is going to hit on a lot of these different issues. I will note, it was a little kind of gallows humor going on their website, and seeing like the first line saying like, we've been doing this for 30 years, right? As if that's a kind of celebration and not an indictment. That's the problem of this. But I mean, not to poison the well too much, but how are y'all feeling going into, COP26?
I mean, it's interesting because you see momentum moving in different directions. So one of the biggest things in terms of COP26 will be getting enough countries to make the contributions towards climate finance. So climate finance is what developing countries need to transition to low carbon societies. And so the goal that was established in Copenhagen, reaffirmed in Paris, was to reach $100 billion, which was pretty modest at the time, and it still hasn't been doing it yet. And the recent reports show that we're not going to make the goal we didn't make the goal by 2020. We're about maybe 80% of the way there. Mm-hmm. So trying to get to that $100 billion goal that was established in 2009, but it looks like things are moving in a positive direction. You can see Biden actually just doubled his climate finance pledge ahead of COP26 from about 5.7 billion to 11.4. You see certain things moving in the right directions. You see certain things that were off the table start to move onto the table. So one thing we specialize in La Ruta del Clima, we talk about issues of loss and damage. So when you look at the pillars of climate action, you have mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you have adaptation, and which is adapting to the effects of climate change. But there's really a third pillar of climate change, of climate action, that's loss and damage, for things that go beyond adaptation. If you're a small island developing state and sea level rise wipes out your nation, it goes beyond that. And so loss and damage has historically been this really hostile issue, especially because countries like the US and European nations and Australia, they don't want to accept liability or compensation. They don't want to accept that their historical emissions are responsible for causing this mass destruction. So you can start to see things that were previously off the table creep on the table, and you start to see certain people grasp a sense of urgency. It's actually been sort of surreal to watch Boris Johnson, of all people, really kind of, it really seemed to sink in the effects that climate change has, and the fact that if we don't have a successful COP, the world's going to be in pretty bad shape, as what the latest science reports have been indicating.
So if we take maybe a broader approach to it, first of all, like in the organization thing, it's just like a shit show. It's like it's so uncertain, everything. There's no certainty how will happen. How do you get there? It's just like just an adventure, or a risky adventure of putting your life in danger to get to the conference. And I mean, to this point, you don't even know where you're going to do quarantine and so on. So it's been an organization sort of nightmare that has put many countries already very angry and emotional about it. So it's going to be a very high pressure sort of place, which for me can go either two ways. It can collapse with no sort of good decision, or pressure, as Sam says, to position certain issues that are very political, and then force the hand of big players to sort of give in to avoid some like open conflict and so on. And maybe the next COP could have even more maybe progressive or radical results. That's like the positive side of it. On the negative side, I mean, we're basically just sort of hitting like the line of this like voluntary approach to climate action, which sort of the Paris Agreement set out. Like basically everybody says what they want to do, and sort of with pressure, countries sort of try to align themselves with no obligation, nothing legal, no way to force you, no way to force Brazil to actually do something better than they are proposing, even though it's insufficient. So there's no real way to force people, our countries, through legal means under the Paris Agreement. So it's basically just voluntary. But what we see is that it's not working. Emissions are not being reduced with the voluntary commitments they have. They're not even halfway what is needed, and the finance is never there. And it's, for example, the finance for the vulnerable community is non-existent. It's never on the table being discussed. So we're seeing that we're reaching a point where climate change we're running out of time to meet the goals that the Paris Agreement has. We're going over the temperature increase that was agreed, and the forecast is super bad, and the system is sort of not working. So either we have some radical change and finance start pouring in, and countries actually start assuming their responsibilities, or we will have some sort of systemic collapse, because there's already many climate activists, and I mean seasoned climate activists that have been participating for decades in the system, that are just why we would go to COP? It doesn't work. So what's the purpose of going there if there's no change, if emissions are not reduced, if vulnerable people get no funding, if countries just keep their own, if developed countries, if the global north just takes no change, no action, no significant transformative action, so there's no point to it. So we're basically reaching that sort of very complex place where people are going to this conference extremely stressed under very harsh conditions, with very bad results, with no money, and bringing back the justice issues that have been there since 1990, when the UNFCCC convention was created, because the issues loss and damage was there on the negotiations of the convention, but it has systematically been ignored by countries. And now that we cannot deny anymore that the island people in the islands are suffering, that people are suffering droughts in Central America, that fires are raging all across the global north, and that there's incredible flooding in Germany. Now that we can see it, now we can just not even imagine it. There's nowhere else to go. And I think this conference is going to be a very interesting politically, and hopefully not a sad experience of human nature, but hopefully we have some real results that sort of save our society soon.
Well, I'd be curious though, like maybe to look at some of the fights that are coming, right? Because this is the thing that we're seeing, like even Boris Johnson was going on at the UN about how it's really easy to be green, right? And you hear a lot of talk from the US too. Like it's becoming very popular for politicians to talk about, climate change, and they believe in all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to the pocketbooks, when it comes to money, we have a different conversation. There's a couple of things that y'all note in your report, and I'll pull it up in just a second. That are going to be some of the challenges of COP26. And I was just curious if y'all could maybe explain the tensions here for our audience. But the first one is on resolving Article 6. Would either of y'all be able to sort of explain what that is and, what the outlook is looking like? I'm pulled this up too for everybody to see.
Sure. So when you talk about Article 6, you're looking at global carbon market mechanisms. So you're looking at kind of allowing certain countries to continue to pollute, to use carbon offset mechanisms. And this has been one of the most contentious issues at the climate conference in recent years. So more or less the entire Paris rulebook, which is the rulebook that was created to carry out the Paris Agreement, has been resolved except for Article 6, because it's been so contentious in terms of how this should be resolved. And in a lot of ways, it's an article that doesn't work. It's a mechanism that doesn't work. And being able to continue to pollute is just something that we can't have. And then really a poor Article 6 resolution undermines the integrity of the Paris Agreement. So this started, the Paris rulebook was supposed to be hashed out at COP24 in Katowice in 2018. It failed. Largely in part because Brazil made a last minute push. They had just elected our friend Bolsonaro, and they just elected our friend over there, and kind of just made a big push because Brazil was looking at something called double counting, and it's really one of the things that undermines the integrity of this article. At the last climate conference, which took place in Madrid and was hosted by Chile, once again, this was not resolved. And, there is some hope that a resolution will happen this year. I'm personally not optimistic, but it is a really problematic resolution. Adrian, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, from what Sam says, there's three things that are very important. First of all, any of the actions that can sort of um, come from the implementation Article 6 can be very good in terms of reducing emissions. But for example, if there's no human rights considerations, we can go back to things like happening in the like decades ago in terms of generating projects where communities are harmed in the in the hope of reducing emissions, especially indigenous communities. So it's a very contentious sort of this sort of engine of the Paris Agreement has to be very tuned and has to have very important limitations that sort of do not generate harm, because this has happened in the past, for example, with the Kyoto Protocol, where communities' human rights were violated, for example, generating dams or things like that, and being displaced to do conservation. So it's a very high stakes sort of article. On the other hand, it's also there's this idea of non-market mechanisms that could also reduce emissions, and this is something that is being pushed by Bolivia historically, and nobody really knows what it is. So sort of putting some letters to actually know what that is and to make it a possibility to do things of reducing emissions beyond just market approaches, just beyond just natural capital, that is super important. But that's something that most negotiators have no clue what that is, and it's just there because of a political fight Bolivia sort of leader a while ago. So that's something very important to accomplish, to have this possibility. And that is something, for example, indigenous people that do not trust the market approaches want, and also communities that have a very close relationship with ecosystems are very concerned. And in the issue, in the case of Latin America, that's super important, because we'll receive so many projects and investments due to Article 6. So the whole idea of carbon colonization, of more colonizing projects to take your land, just sort of save emissions to protect the development in other countries in the global north, is a concern that is across the board in Latin America, especially for NGOs, because this could just spark some new colonization sort of actions in our territories, especially in indigenous territories or rural areas, in the sake of reducing or fixing carbon or protecting the Amazon, for example. So it's a very, very interesting fight. It's a fight where the dimension of human rights has been super opposed by many countries, and so the environmental safeguards and human rights safeguards, it's also an issue. So we depend on this article to sort of move forward, but at the same time, it just could really generates harm if it is not properly structured. So it's a very tricky situation with this.
And when we talk about looking at resolutions, the U.S. remains a key wild card, because when you see, and you've seen a lot of continuity between Obama and Trump in terms of the line that the U.S. took on certain areas of the negotiation. So a lot of it rests on, if we see a resolution on Article 6, if we make progress, a lot of it will we see a new U.S. delegation, or will Biden and Kerry largely be a reversion to the Obama era?
Yeah, and I know you, Sam, had sort of mentioned how there's been some positive developments on the $100 billion climate finance goal regarding Biden. But I mean, could you all just sort of help folks understand like the role that this has, not only in combating climate change, but as a kind of, as a justice issue as well, right? When it comes to avoiding green colonization. I mean, one thing, for example, in the US, I remember there was, I think it was AOC's Green New Deal. So one of the early plans came out with this idea that the United States could become the leader in the green revolution by patenting a bunch of technology and then selling to the rest of the world, right? I can see that that's probably not something, and like she, to her credit, pressure, she dropped it. But I can see a lot of people, I can imagine a lot of folks who maybe don't have the same kind of people in their ear like AOC does, sort of trying to find a way, for a greening economy to be, a new gold rush, especially in parts of the world where funding for any project is usually something that's difficult to come by.
Well, climate finance at its core is key for developing countries. Most developing countries don't have the resources to transition to a low carbon economy without the assistance from developed nations who are responsible for this whole crisis, who are responsible for the vast majority of historical greenhouse gas emissions. So when we look at climate finance, we need to, it brings up, the concept of climate justice in terms of having these countries and being able to finance the technologies to reduce their carbon emissions, as well as to adapt to the effects of climate change. You're looking at both mitigation and adaptation as key to climate finance. And the $100 billion per year goal, which was established in 2009, it's critical, but in many ways the floor, and we're not even meeting the floor yet. And when you look at certain studies, there's been a couple of really good climate finance studies that have come out, and the majority show that the U.S. should be providing at least 40% of climate finance based on historical emissions, the size of the economy, et cetera. In terms of financing the Green Climate Fund, Obama just pledged a couple $1 billion and Trump reneged on the majority of it. So the U.S. has given so little in terms of climate finance. And so Biden, when around April, around Earth Day last year, he announced his intention to his climate finance pledges, which was pegged at about $5.7 billion, which is an awfully low sum. If the goal is $100 billion, the U.S. should be providing at least 40% based on historical submissions. He's only offering $5.7 billion. A lot of NGOs, environmental groups, and human rights groups were asking for at least $12 billion. So he provides just $5.7 billion. It got a lot of criticism, especially in the climate community. Last week, they upped it, or 2 weeks ago, they upped it, doubled it to about $11.4 billion. And at this point, it's simply just a pledge, but you do see, countries not accepting their role, not accepting their historical missions, trying to get out of liability, trying to get out of any sort of compensation that they can. And right now what we're seeing is we're missing the target of a modest goal that was set back in 2009, reaffirmed in 2015. It's 2021. We got to get to 100 billion this year at COP, one way or another.
So also on that topic, one of the key concerns, at least from Global South or Latin American perspective, is that much of that finance is just more debt. They're loans. So we're getting loans to sort of clean up the mess that the developed world made. So we get loans to not develop using carbon, and we get loans to adapt to the impacts that the developed world created, and that just increases his national debt. And if you see it, just to put like a perspective from a small country like mine in Costa Rica, right now we have this huge deficit where you can, once you retire, nobody hires a new person. Just the social services are being reduced, and everything that is social is being underfunded, cut, limited. So we have no funding for example, a major transformative adaptation projects or mitigation projects. And we just depend on loans, for example, for an electric train or things like that. And also to put into perspective, this $100 billion are for both adaptation and mitigation actions. So, and this go all across the world being accessed. But when we talk about, which is my topic, of course, I'm going to talk about loss and damage. When we talk about loss and damage, we're talking about $500 billion per year. So that's 5 times more than what is being pledged now for both loss and for mitigation and adaptation. So that's sort of to put into perspective how huge the difference is between what the impacts of climate change cost to people, and that communities are paying out of their pocket with no help from the international community, and the little bit that developed countries pledge to help mitigation and adaptation actions, and they don't even pay for that, even though they pledged it years ago. So it's just like a huge thing for the real implementation of climate action if we don't get real finance, and especially if we don't get real finance for, as Sam mentioned, for the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement, not just for the things that generate business, because the other issue is that this climate finance is based on the idea that you have to make climate action profitable, a business opportunity. So it's about selling technology. It's about having countries use your technology so you generate dependencies. And then not only you give them the money to sort of put these this train or put these solar powers, but you sell them the batteries and the technologies, and you own the patents. So all this is transformation in the economy that the global south is undergoing with the patents and the technology and the resources and the loans of the developed world, who cause the climate change at the end. So it furthers the dependency and this sort of lack of self-determination that the global south can have, and on the basis of the same crisis that the global north caused. So it's sort of, you never lose. You're never losing. You're in the side of power. You make a profit from your own fault and your harm, and still you give them loans to pay you to fix your problem.
Adrian, could you just historicize the resistance to the loss damage at the UN for us? You mentioned it's been 20 years sort of on the back burner. Has it been something that's been gradually receiving more support? Or is it something that all of a sudden people are just realizing we need to do this and we'll have to support it?
Well, that is the super interesting question, because for me, I mean, I've been on this about 7 to 8 years. So I thought loss and damage was this new thing, like, oh man, we're finally getting to the crisis. We see the fires, the drought, the Amazon is on fire. Oh, it has to be now that we're putting attention. But I mean, in the research that our organization has done, I mean, from the negotiation of the UNFCCC, of the Convention on Climate Change, the Pacific Islands, Vanuatu, and all those were already asking for loss and damage. They were already asking for financial mechanism. They were already asking for insurance. They were already asking for the developed world to have a pool of funding for communities to deal with to address the loss and damage that was going to happen, that they saw that it was happening, and that it was an existential threat to their country, to their lives. And this is just got exponential in the field. That's something you can see now across the board. But so historically, this was there, and it was not accepted in the structure of the convention. But they're very stubborn. They're very stubborn and smart people. They put in a note when they ratified the convention saying that they did not give up the right to ask for compensation and ask for reparations. So that's there. And that same note is also in the Paris Agreement, because they tried again to put compensation in the Paris Agreement, but John Kerry, for example, opposed to it. So again, they had no way to have it there. So again, they ratified the Paris Agreement, but they put this note that they did not give up their rights to ask for reparations. And the U.S. unfortunately won the sort of this battle there with the Paris Agreement, having this sort of article in a decision called Paragraph 51, where it sort of forbids countries to negotiate within the UNFCCC anything regarding to liability and compensation regarding loss and damage. So the US went sort of one step more to sort of push down the historical fight that countries from the Pacific started. But between the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, many times this topic has been brought by African countries, by less developed countries, by Latin American countries, and we have some progress. For example, we have this something called the Warsaw Mechanisms on Loss and Damage, which sort of starts a dialogue on experiences and learning, but at the end, there's no funding. So if you have no funding to sort of give for example, give money for the people that lost their houses in the last hurricanes in Central America. So what would you get with some website of experience sharing? I mean, what some expert is going to teach somebody that lost their crops or lost their house on flood about loss and damages? That they just lived it. they don't need no more experience on how to deal with it. They need the resources to face it, and that's what countries need. So that has been systematically being denied since the 1990s when the UNFCCC was created. So it's not new. It's continually new because it never advances, because it just keeps being obstacled systematically by the global north. So it's a historical fight. It's a fight that many climate activists sort of ignore because it just keeps going for decades. And you sort of, when you begin to your journey into this sort of political space, you sort of find it and you find there is nothing about it. There is no advance, there's no money. There's not even a definition on loss and damage within the UNFCCC, because that's the point of lack of progress that this issue has. But it's completely not new. But there is a long story of political fight from the global south to ask for justice and ask for compensation on the adverse impacts of climate change.
On one hand, you have, certain countries, that could disappear. Some of these small developing states, could disappear in the coming decades. On the other hand, ahead of COP21 in Paris, John Kerry famously said in a Rolling Stone interview, if you want to get something done, don't go down that road in terms of addressing loss and damage.